In the dark streets of Nazi Germany's totalitarian state, there was a shadow that destroyed voices of protest and suppressed any form of resistance with force. Gestapo's infamous practices like Schutzhaft or protective custody enabled them to arrest people without any trial or any charges pressed against them, which mostly led to torture and imprisonment.
Gestapo. The word itself has a special resonance around the world. But how much blood, how much misery, how much sorrow, but above all, how much cruelty is bound up with it.
But before discussing the ways through which this oppression worked, it is necessary to look at how the Gestapo's establishment and organization came to be. The Gestapo, or Geheimstaatspolizei, was created in 1933, just after Adolf Hitler ascended to power. One of the most infamous organizations in the history of the Third Reich was the Gestapo. This secret police force acted as an enforcer for the Nazi Party and was active throughout the regime's reign until 1945. The Gestapo had a large network of informants and spies. It spied on all Germans and brutally crushed any form of opposing idea. This was the quintessential symbol of the Nazi totalitarian state. The Gestapo was formed by the Prussian secret police in 1851. After the end of the First World War, the Prussian secret police were reorganized and the Gestapo was formed in 1933. Heinrich Himmler was one of the most influential leaders of the Nazi Party and contributed to the development of the organization. He was promoted to the Gestapo chief in 1934. He then developed it into an instrument for quelling the opposition. The Gestapo had subordinated offices at the regional and local levels called Stapostellen and Stapo-Leitstellen that implemented the Gestapo's activities. These offices were managed by highly ranked police officers who worked under Himmler. The Gestapo's structure was pyramidal, with Himmler in direct control of the Gestapo and all its activities. The organizational structure of the Gestapo was made in such a way that it remained a secret police force, and certain laws did not bind it, except, of course, the law that enacted it. This structure allowed the Gestapo to go about its business unfettered by legal considerations, becoming a formidable tool of Nazi repression. The Gestapo's powers came from the Enabling Act of 1933 and the Gestapo Law of 1936, which provided the organization with almost full autonomy in eradicating any form of opposition. The Gestapo had legal rights to arrest and detain suspects without trial or even any charges being brought against them. They used something known as Schutzhaft, or protective custody, to detain people indefinitely. The Gestapo used different methods of interrogation that involved the use of force, physical and mental threats, and forceful confessions from detainees. Torture was a common tool of interrogation, which included physical abuse, lack of sleep, and many others. Tactics such as spying through informers, and espionage were also very essential for the Gestapo, since they helped the organization monitor the population. The Gestapo's tactics were aimed at bringing people into obedience, where the organization would employ force and coercion to get what it wanted from the victims. This was a typical modus operandi of the Gestapo, and their use of torture and forced testimonies is still regarded as a black mark against the organization. Apart from the use of physical force in interrogations, the Gestapo also resorted to mind games to get their detainees to talk. This consisted of threats to family members, fake assurances of release, and setting the prisoners against one another. The Gestapo also employed modern spying equipment like telephone tapping and concealed microphones in order to spy on suspect persons or organizations. The Gestapo's authority was extended by the application of V-Manner, informer, and Agentin, spies, who were deployed in the opposition groups and reported to the Gestapo. These informants often resorted to force, threats, or promises in order to get the information they wanted from their victims. Interrogations were often carried out to destroy the prisoner's will and character, frequently using both physical and psychological means. The idea of using interrogations, known as Protocol, meant that there was a standard way of interrogation to increase the likelihood of attaining information. The Gestapo focused on a number of people and groups that were considered to be a menace to the Nazi government. The political dissidents such as the Communists, Social Democrats, and other people of the left wing were the first to be dealt with cruelly. The Gestapo also discriminated against people of color, Jews, Gypsies, and anyone else that the German Nazis regarded as subhuman. Other groups that suffered persecution included religious groups such as the Catholics and Protestants, among whom they were persecuted if they opposed the regime. The Jews, homosexuals, people with disabilities, and any other individuals who did not fit the Nazis' ideal were also affected. The Gestapo applied different techniques to isolate and oppress such groups as the Jehovah's Witnesses, including spying, stool pigeons, and searches. The Gestapo's victims were targeted for arrest and detention, torture, and deportation to the concentration camps. Some of them were killed or died in custody because of poor treatment. The Gestapo was an important part of the Nazi regime's policy of terror, using force to eliminate any potential opposition to the government. These were some of the reasons. Jehovah's Witnesses were persecuted for their refusal to swear allegiance to the Nazi regime. Freemasons, who were seen as a threat to Nazi ideology. Homosexuals, who were arrested and imprisoned under the Nazi regime's anti-homosexuality laws. Disabled individuals who were subjected to forced sterilization and euthanasia. Romani people who were targeted for their perceived racial impurity. Soviet prisoners of war who were subjected to forced labor and brutal treatment. The Gestapo's repression of these groups was often through raids, arrests, and deportations, and were all well coordinated. The organization employed an extensive network of agents and spies to monitor and apprehend people and organizations, which were considered undesirable by the Nazi authorities. They were a very important part of the Nazi regime and its genocide, especially in the Holocaust. This police force was supposed to detect, detain, and expel Jews and other groups of people to concentration camps. The Gestapo collaborated with other departments, such as the SS and other organizations, that brought the extermination of 6 million Jews, millions of others who were considered to be subhuman. This force was also involved in the massacres and mass shootings, and it was involved in the Babi Yar massacre in Ukraine in 1941, where over 33,000 Jews were murdered. Hence, the Gestapo's implication in genocide was not restricted to only the Holocaust. It also controlled the process of genocide of the Romani people, homosexuals, people with disabilities, and political opponents. Gestapo's chief Heinrich Himmler played a major role in the process of making the organization into an efficient instrument of repression against dissidents and opponents. The Gestapo was headed by Reinhard Heydrich, who was also in charge of the planning and coordination of the Holocaust. Notable officers involved were Ernst Kaltenbrunner, who took over the functions of Heydrich in the Gestapo's leadership, Adolf Eichmann, who was instrumental in the process of deportation of Jews to concentration camps, Klaus Barbie, also called the Butcher of Lyon due to his violent repression of the French resistance. One of the most horrible figures of the Holocaust was a doctor named Josef Mengele, who had been torturing prisoners in the Auschwitz concentration camp by conducting medical experiments on them. Such people, among others, helped the Gestapo to become infamous for its brutality and complete lack of mercy. What they did and how they acted and decided brought pain and death to millions of people. Others would include Rudolf Diels, the first chief of the Gestapo, who was one of the main organizers of the Gestapo's structure and practices. Werner Best was a Gestapo officer and played a crucial role in the formulation of the legal aspect of the Gestapo and its working. Heinrich Müller, a brutal and competent Gestapo chief of the Gestapo, was in charge of the organization and its work was called the Gestapo Müller. Another important person was Hermann Krümi, who was Eichmann's deputy and who was directly involved in the process of deportation of Jews to concentration camps. Otto Ohlendorf, a man who served in the Gestapo and who commanded the Eizen Group D, which was involved in the extermination of Jews in the Soviet territory. Himmler and Heydrich and other distinguished officers outlined the Gestapo's policies and methods. These officers were the main leaders of the Gestapo and were directly involved in the formulation of its policies and the use of force. The Gestapo was losing its control over Germany as the Allied forces closed in and the internal opposition increased. When the Nazi regime started to collapse, the Gestapo force also lost its authority. In April 1945, when the Soviet troops were nearing Berlin, Himmler tried to surrender, but it was already too late. The Gestapo was officially dissolved on May 8, 1945, after Germany's surrender. At the end of the war, most of the Gestapo officers were arrested, tried, and punished for their atrocities. Gestapo leaders were brought to the book during the Nuremberg trials and subsequent trials that were conducted in relation to the Nazi regime. Despite this fact, the Gestapo came to its end, and with them, the period of terror and oppression was over. The Gestapo's legacy extends beyond its brutal methods and atrocities. It has also had a lasting impact on modern law enforcement. The Gestapo's use of surveillance, informants, and interrogation techniques has influenced law enforcement agencies around the world. Human rights. The Gestapo's atrocities led to the establishment of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Holocaust education. The Gestapo's role in the Holocaust has made it a central topic in Holocaust education and remembrance. German society. The Gestapo's legacy has led to ongoing debates in Germany about accountability, guilt, and collective memory. International justice. The Gestapo's crimes led to the establishment of international tribunals and courts, such as the Nuremberg trials and the International Criminal Court. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to hit like, subscribe, and turn notifications on so you don't miss any of our new content.